One of the, I suppose you might say, comical, if it weren't so serious, aspects of our day is the promiscuous misuse of language. Language. Always trigger words at a certain time. At one time, Wall Street was a trigger word. So was and is communist, a trigger word. And so the word today, I think in our times, in this decade, terrorist, the word terrorist. What is a terrorist? And how is that word used by, say, the establishment press, or by commentators, or by people generally hearing that word so frequent? What is a terrorist? And it occurs to me, this applies when we think of Middle East, of course. We think of Arabs. And the word Arab is a rather generic word, too, isn't it? But we think of Arabs, and we think of the Israeli conflict, and we think of Northern Ireland, and we think of Nicaragua and Central America, as we did of Vietnam. Who and what is a terrorist? Now, it occurred to me, Edward Said is a scholar. Dr. Said teaches, professor of English at Columbia University, and author of a remarkable book called Orientalism, and a book called The Question of Palestine. And it occurs to me, Edward Said, seated here, one of your colleagues, and who agrees with you on the Middle Eastern problem, is Noam Chomsky. And Noam Chomsky is acknowledged by just about anybody as the great scholar in the world on the subject of linguistics. Not accidentally, he and you are together on the subject of what we call the Middle East. But start with the word terrorist. My image, a reader of that part of the country, Arab terrorists, immediately.
Right. Well, the thing about the word terrorist is that it's the most vague term in the world, in a sense, but also the most exact word. And I think what you're supposed to get into your head as soon as you hear it is somebody who is menacing, somebody who is foreign, somebody who for some reason doesn't like America, and somebody who is probably an Arab, as you said. In other words, anybody whom we don't like, we don't know too much about him, we don't need to know. You notice the word is used a great deal, but it's always used about things that we don't know anything about. I mean, you think of the bombing of the embassy. Terrorists did that, okay? Now, what does that mean? It covers just about everything. And it suggests and signifies a kind of vague enemy. But, and here's where your observation about language comes in, it now stands for everything that we not only don't know and don't like, but it's associated with groups of people, specific groups of people, and specifically Arabs, for example.
Certainly third world.
Non-white, non-Christian, non-European. And it's just a blanket term, so that your enemy is turned into, it's a dehumanizing word. It strips the enemy of an identity, and above all, it strips the enemy of a cause. A terrorist, there's no reason. I mean, as we see it on the press every day, when we hear the Secretary of State or the President talking about terrorism, it's anybody who does anything to America, regardless of history. Terrorism is a word without history, because the terrorist just does it for the sheer delight in killing. I mean, this is the caricature we've built up. Now, the result of that is that language has lost its meaning. I mean, we cannot distinguish between an enemy with a reason to kill, with a reason to fight, with a reason to exist. He's just a terrorist. It's one of the most frightening, this is 1984, it's an Orwellian term. Chomsky's interested in that, as am I. It's the failure to use words for exact, historical, human realities.
See, isn't it amazing? If there's a promiscuousness in misuse of a word, there has to be a promiscuity in also misthinking.
Absolutely.
And double thinking. Double
talking. Or not, and then after a while, not thinking at all.
Yes.
And I notice it, you see it on the establishment press, that they start to use the word too. They stop using the word the enemy or the other side or giving identity to people, and they start using the word terror. One of the great examples of this was during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. Israeli journalists noticed that for 1 year before the Israeli invasion, the Israeli military, started to use the word terrorist instead of using the word Palestinian. And terrorists then became a species of vermin or cockroaches. In other words, they talk about cleaning out terrorist nests. Mm-hmm. And one Israeli journalist said that this made it possible for them to bomb refugee camps. Because if you assume in advance that they are terrorists who live like insects, then you're bombing them and you're cleaning them out. They used to use words like cleaning them out. And after a while, the correspondents began to refer to them. So that at the time of the massacres at Sabra and Shatila, at the beginning, if you looked at the press reports, people believed the account that the Israeli army had allowed these people in there, the phalange, the fascists who did the actual killing, because they said they were cleaning out terrorists, who turned out to be women and children. So, I think not enough attention is devoted to not just the horrible sort of anti-aesthetic quality of using words, in a kind of repetitive and sort of dumb way, the way you say terrorist, like that, but also that you can actually provoke violence in a strange sort of way. In other words, if you say that something is X, then you can treat it as X, even though it may happen to be Y, and that's the frightening part of it.
Now, we live in a highly technological age with more and more weaponry that is more and more sophisticated, and thus the user of that weaponry is more and more distant from the target, the victim. So the question is, when napalm is dropped from a plane, say on a village in Nicaragua or El Salvador, by the United States or a surrogate or by somebody else, or as it was in Vietnam, that is not called terrorism.
No, because you see, terrorism is always associated with what we think, or what the government or the press tells us are these sort of stray people out there. Everything we do is right. We are for freedom, we are for good, we're for justice, we're for everything. And it's not, you see, I think, Studs, I don't think it's just the actual doing of the deed. I think you've got something that's business about language, because also language can put distance between you and what you're doing. In other words, if you're saying that what you're involved in, I once had a student at Columbia who was in the army in Vietnam, and I said, "What did you do in Vietnam?" And he said, I think he was maybe kidding me because he knew I was an English professor. He said, "I did target retrieval." I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "It means bombing." But I mean, if you call it target retrieval, you see.
So now we're talking about euphemism, aren't we?
Well, it's a sort of euphemism. I think it's worse than euphemism, because euphemism is dressing up something, in a kind of fancy way. But this actually, as you said, puts distance. It sterilizes, you might say. If you cover it with a technical word. And if you do, you do it with a lot of footnotes and numbers and things of that sort. It comes out all right.
Come to footnotes, by the way. I know one thing's on your mind. I had Joan Peters on my program. She wrote a book called From Time Immemorial. It's in a 6th printing, and it's rather distinguished writers and scholars saying it's a great book, in which she's implying, the undercurrent of the book is there is no such thing as Palestinians. And the Arabs are recent arrivals who have pushed other Arabs to be onto this area, whether it be West Bank or Gaza. And by the way, you are Palestinian.
I'm a Palestinian, yes, although I think that according to her, I don't exist.
You don't exist. Okay, well, I know it's your prerogative tonight to reply, because I must admit, I did give her a pass. She had the hour. Okay, so it's your turn. Before that, though, I have to come back to this matter of terrorist and distance. I'm also literal now, in addition to the fact that them and us, we're not terrorists. The fact that a highly mechanized, developed nation, materially and technologically, is of a distance from the others, the insects, the cockroaches. And the actual distance itself allows the person, the young man up there who may be dropping the stuff, not seeing the face of the other either, you see. And so there, too, though, that is not a terrorist by that definition, you see.
No, I mean, I think
That's
what we're...
part of it, too,
I think it is, absolutely. And I think, I don't think we should minimize the ugliness of any situation involving violence and the taking of human life. I mean, that is bad. But my feeling is, without wishing to excuse what has come to be called outrages or terrorism, any of that stuff, which is bad, but I think we would go a long way to somehow minimizing its effects if we, A, didn't use language that distances ourselves from it, and B, try to understand what might have produced it, I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, anybody who involves himself or herself in violence of that sort obviously is not doing it most of the time out of sheer mindless destructiveness. I mean, what you're dealing with are people whose history, whose reality, whose culture has been abused, and dealing with a powerful and rich enemy, such as, you know, some of the industrial Western countries, for example, might have been, who have a record. I mean, you've got to understand, because I come from the third world, right? And my part of the world, India, etc., they were colonized for hundreds of years. So our feelings about the West are at best complicated, you know. I mean, there's a long historical memory, as you know. So that one should try and understand that and not dodge it with a label.
And so let's go one step further before you come to Joan Peters' book. Stereotype and caricature. Another word, Middle East. Now, Middle East to us of the Western world, so listen, United States, means one thing only, trouble.
Yeah.
Middle East means terrorists, Arabs, and sort of westernized.
And oil, don't forget.
And oil.
Yeah.
But Middle East, I believe, is something else, too.
Yeah, of course.
It does have a history.
It does have a history, and it has, of course, all people, you know, sort of make myths and stereotypes out of other people that they've had dealings with, you know. I mean, Arabs and Iranians, for example, have a long history of trading stereotypes. And if you think of if you go to the Middle East and see what people think about America, it's you know, it's the funniest thing. I mean, it's like a cartoon. But, you see, along with the stereotypes goes what you said earlier, the question of power. I mean, when we say that the Middle East is essentially terrorist and this, that, and the other thing, we're dealing with a society that is, very much more complicated, but also a great deal weaker. I mean, the inequality in the strength and the power of these societies is very important. So that our stereotypes about them also make it possible for us to dismiss them in some way. And above all, to reduce them to something. It becomes easier if you say, well, of course, all Arabs are this, that, and the other thing. It's racist. Yeah? It's also a way of controlling. In other words, that's all they are.
I'm thinking of you now.
Yeah.
Let's say someone
I'm a terrorist.
No, someone say Edward Said, scholar, Orientalism, remarkable paper and an essay on Michel Foucault. But you, you're westernized. Indeed, you've had a Western orientation.
Yeah.
But you're not Napul, you know.
No, I'm not Naipaul. No.
No.
Because, I mean, Naipaul really hates where he comes from, you see. I mean, and he spends all of his time, I think. I mean, I've written about him. And he's a very fine writer. But you see, his idea is that the East, or wherever, he's an Indian from Trinidad, but he thinks that the whole third world is just one immense mass of lies and deceit and so on. But unfortunately, there he plays into the hands of people in the West who like to think that that's what's wrong with it. And above all, he's an apologist for colonialism. He thinks that the best days of Africa was when the French and the British were there. See, I don't think
and
that.
I'm coming to something else. When I said in the Middle East, I said something else. I mean, there was a culture. There is a culture. And there is a history.
Very rich.
And there was something
complex.
called Philistan, was there not?
Yes, Philistine, which is the place in the Middle East from which I come.
Yeah.
And you know, to approximately 4 million Palestinians, it has a meaning. I mean,
When
it's a real
was that
place.
word used, Philistine?
Well, it's used, for example, by all the Arab geographers of the Middle Ages. It's well known in Arabic writing from the beginning of the Arabian conquest of the 7th and 8th centuries. So, I mean, what you now hear is that Palestine really never existed and so on and so forth. But of course it did. It also was a Roman name. I mean, the Romans used it as a province in their empire. But to all Arabs, it has had a historical meaning because it signified the place where Jerusalem, Al-Quds, was, which is it's the third holiest city in Islam. And of course, for Arab Christians, I'm a Christian. I mean, I come from a Christian background. It also means, obviously, the place of Christianity. I mean, Palestine. So in all these senses, it's a real place. But what is amusing is the sense in which, since, the last 25 or 30 years, there's been a concerted attempt, there you go, now, to strip what we were talking about as overloading a word with too many meanings. Terrorism means everything we don't like. What you have here is a word, Palestine, which is being stripped of meaning. So that in my own lifetime, I've watched Palestine disappear. I mean, actually it did disappear when it became Israel in 1948. But also retrospectively, not content with also doing that, we've watched, as Palestinians, our history disappear. We've watched our society disappear, and we've watched now even our identities disappear. So we're told now that we never really existed. Wow. You see, and it's as if it's part of the same process by which, you know, a reality is denuded of any density of any existence. It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary. The better to be able to wipe us out like vermin. You see.
Where? Let's go back, since you mentioned yourself personally. Your ancestors, parents, grandparents, where did they live?
My father's family comes from Jerusalem, and my father and grandfather and great-grandfather were in Jerusalem as many generations as maybe 7 or 8 generations, as far as I know, I mean, recorded. My mother's family comes from Nazareth and from Safed. And there too, I mean, there's a long history, and more important than that, we between us, there are a large number of people, and I know, because it's of great interest to me, where each of them came from, where they went, etc. And there's a long history of not only my family, but my family's friends, who lived in these places, and for whom Palestine was their place of birth and of origin. It's quite an extraordinary thing to discover, you know, that you don't really, that none of this is true. Somehow somebody's saying it in a book, say, well, none of this is true, you're all sort of immigrants.
Come to that. I'm just thinking, so I suppose you have to come to this book itself by
Well, we can talk about it as a phenomenon, you see. I mean, it's
a phenomenon.
It's an extraordinary thing, because here, what you have, actually, in the last, I think it all goes back to the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, where what was at issue, you see, was Palestinian nationalism, the existence of a Palestinian people which had acquired national and international dimension, United Nations, peace conferences, people talking about the Palestinians. President Carter talked about the need for a Palestinian homeland. The attack of the Israelis was to wipe out Palestinian nationalism, because Israelis understand that Israel, for better or for worse, is built upon the ruins of Arab Palestine, of whatever was in Palestine, okay? So there was this Palestinian identity, and it had to be destroyed as a political and national thing. There are also many Arabs inside Israel who are Palestinians. Israel has 650,000 Palestinian citizens, in addition to the 1.3 million people on the West Bank and Gaza, which have been occupied since 1967. Now, this book that we're talking about, it seems to me, is part of the phenomenon to strip these people of any national identity, to just call them miscellaneous Arabs. I mean, what is the point of the book? The book argues that the people who call themselves Palestinian are not really Palestinian. Palestine, she says, and Israelis have said this from the beginning, when they came to the Zionists, when they first came to Palestine, they said Palestine is empty. It's an uninhabited land. And therefore, we can take it over. I think this is, strictly speaking, unique in the history of conquest and settlement. I mean, when the Puritans came to America, they saw the Indians. When the Zionists came to Palestine from Europe, they didn't see the Palestinians. And historically, they found it impossible to acknowledge the existence of another people. In this way, they were like many Europeans who were coming to parts of the Third World in Africa and so on. They didn't recognize the people who were there as having an equal right. Now, what you have in this book is, first of all, the repetition of an argument. The book is totally unoriginal. That's what's extraordinary about it. It's been passed by a lot of famous people like Saul Bellow and Barbara Tuchman and so on as an important work of scholarship. In fact, she simply repeats the arguments made by Israelis and Zionist apologists beginning in the late 40s and the early 50s, including a man called Frankenstein. She lifts whole parts of the book. I mean, she takes the argument and so on, and she proves that the Palestinians, in fact, were not there. And not only that, but that there was a Jewish majority in Palestine. She relies on figures from a Turkish demographer, Kemal Karpat, who is now at the University of Wisconsin, who's a well-known demographer, who did work on the Ottoman census of 1892, and she completely falsifies his figures. She reduces them by about a tenth, and proves that most of the Palestinians who were in areas of Palestine taken over by Israel in 1948 were really from other parts of the Arab world. They were not really Palestinians. Now, her sources, her references, and so on, once you check them, almost all fall down. She misquotes, She misappropriates testimony from various bodies like the British Committees of Investigation and so on. The idea being that the Palestinians have no right to be there. In other words, most Israelis will admit that there are Palestinians there, and it's a problem for them.
I was about to say, isn't there more discussion there
Than there is here.
Than there is here?
In fact,
Yeah.
if I might just mention
Yes.
something, the most distinguished Israeli historian of the Palestinian Arab national movement, a man called Yehoshua Porat, says, I mean, he's written two of the most distinguished volumes on, they're called The Emergence of the Palestinian Arab National Movement, published in America and in England. And he says, let us not have any more discussions by any of our ideologues about the non-existence of the Palestinians. He said that's a mischievous and evil argument. This is an Israeli speaking. And here you have Americans saying that they don't exist and using demography and statistics that no Israeli or very few Israelis would want to use today because they deal with them. They see them every day. And these are people, we're talking about Palestinians for whom places like Lydda and Haifa and so on are all places of actual residence. They mean something, and they were from there. And these are people scattered all around. She says that they are now, in fact, not really refugees. They just simply went back to where they came from. Whereas many Israeli sources record the actual dispersal of the Palestinians, 800,000+ of them in 1948 who were driven out.
So I'm thinking about time, and I'm coming back to
Yeah.
Joan Peters' book, since she was a guest on my show. And she said, if I recall, and I'll paraphrase, I want to be as accurate as I possibly can, that it was a deliberate planned move by, the word Arab is used generically.
Yes.
Everybody's but Arabs used other Arabs, the nomadic, transient, homeless ones, and shoved them into these areas, say about 2 years ahead, 2 years ago, recently.
That's right.
That there was no past there.
Yes. See, that's simply untrue, because one of the things that's missing from her book is a simple fact that up until 1948, the entire area of Palestine that was settled by Jews and owned by Jews, the Jews, when they came there, bought land. Do you know what it amounted to in the total surface of Palestine? She does not mention it at all. They owned less than, or approximately 6% of the whole of Palestine. I mean, she makes it sound as if the Jews had sort of bought land all up and down of Palestine, and the Arabs were flooding in there to take advantage of these great settlements. She doesn't mention that it was a minuscule, tiny portion of the total land surface of Palestine. That's number one. Okay. Number two, what she also doesn't mention is that all of the Jewish settlements in Palestine up to 1948 were totally excluded Arabs from any possible benefit that they might have. The concept of Jewish labor, which was central to the settlements, the Zionist settlements, programmatically, politically excluded Arabs. So what she says, they were coming there because of Jewish prosperity, but the Jewish prosperity were for Jews, it wasn't for Arabs. So, I mean, the myth, that's number three. The other thing that she says is the Arabs left because they were told to leave. In fact, one of her main sources, a man called James Park, who wrote a book called Whose Land, says that, I mean, one of her sources on whom she relies a great deal, she doesn't mention this, says, in fact, that there's not a single scrap of evidence to prove that the Arabs left other than because they were afraid and they were terrorized into leaving. If I might just make one last point on this same question. Her other main source is a man called Neville Mandel. Most of the book, the argument is taken from Bernard Frankenstein's book on Justice for My People. It's a book that came out in the early 50s, and a lot of her arguments come from that book. But another source that she uses is a man called Neville Mandel, who's a distinguished historian of Palestine before 1917, before the Balfour Declaration. He makes it absolutely clear that before the Balfour Declaration in 1917, there was such a thing as Palestinian nationalism. The Palestinians had a sense of identity, and as early as 1876, there were Palestinian deputies who were sent to the Ottoman Parliament. So I think this whole argument about numbers and all is just a tremendous fog, and if you read the book, it's written in an astonishingly bad language, and it's full of venom and hatred for the Palestinians, who are described over and over again as terrorists and people who have no legitimate right to Palestine. It's an extraordinary performance.
But as you're talking now, I imagine there is a debate going on within Israel itself, or arguments going on.
There is indeed. There is indeed.
But not here.
Not here. Yeah. Not here. And it's one of the things that is very striking, and I really have to sort of take my hat off to Israeli journalists,
Because Israeli journalism is much more open, for reasons that I cannot understand, than American journalism and in the American Jewish community. I mean, an Israeli journalist will write about the torture in the West Bank, about the detentions, the blowing up of houses, the punishments, the occupation of South Lebanon, in great detail. The American press, for the most part, avoids complicated subjects, complicated in quotation marks, subjects like that, and above all, American Jews, with a few exceptions, like Noam Chomsky, whom we talked about earlier, and a few others who are beginning to speak
well,
up.
I.F. Stone.
I.F. Stone, you know, there are a number of people that one could point to, but by and large, both the organizations and the mass of individuals tend to follow a line. And look at the presidential candidates. We're in a presidential election. We are the most powerful nation in the Middle East today, outside of the area, and our policy is a joke. I mean, we don't have a policy. Everybody's sort of outbidding, you know, Mondale and Reagan are outbidding each other, saying who could be more for the Jews.
Yeah, we're coming to something interesting here. We have to go back to history again and stereotype and caricature, as indeed Jews have been stereotyped down through the years, and all minority peoples have. So we come to Middle East again, the Arab, the exotic, the different, the non-us, the other. And so you're talking about history of literature. Now, there have been travelers who have seen Palestine. You speak of Western travelers, including Mark Twain.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things is if you look at the...
This is from your book, I might point out, the question of Palestine. The question of... I don't mean to interrupt. I'm always adding parenthetical comments here. There's now in paperback Edward Said's book, The Question of Palestine, that Anthony Lewis, the New York Times columnist, calls a compelling call for identity and justice, and that's vintage publishers available. But the question of, which means, hey, the question of X, as you put it.
Right, exactly.
The question of the Loch Ness Monster.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You thought of that, right. I
Well,
mentioned it, right. Yeah, I mean, because Palestine is not an ordinary place, let's face it. I mean, Palestine is a place which Christians think is theirs, which Muslims think is theirs, which Jews think is theirs, which Arabs think is theirs. I mean, if you think of Shakespeare's plays, for example, Henry IV, you know, everybody knows Falstaff and so on. The point of one of the major points in that play is that the old King Henry IV wants to, before he dies, he wants to go to Jerusalem. Yeah? I mean, if you think of Dante, I mean, European culture without Palestine and the Holy Land is an unimaginable thing, right? Now, the interesting thing is that everybody makes his own Palestine. That's really what, in a sense, I was writing in this book. You have one traveler who goes there, and he says it's the most flowery, verdant, wonderful place. And then you have another traveler going the same time, and he'll say it's desolate and waste and all the rest of it. You have a third traveler, who will go there, and what does he see? He remembers the Bible, and he starts to quote the Bible. And he sees through his eyes the scenes of the Bible. It doesn't matter what's actually there. See, that's the point. The point is that you can make of it what you want by talking about it. But it's because it's a special place. And my argument, and the argument I think of most of us Palestinians is, okay, so it's a special place. But let's not forget that the people who actually were there, very humble, who can't get on the Studs Terkel show, you wouldn't know them. Nevertheless, for them, it's also their home, you see. And what we are watching here is this kind of sort of wiping away of not just an official history, but a lived history, of which is, you know what I mean, what people say in memory. And you know, I mean, if I listen to my mother or my grandmother talk about the Palestine they grew up in, it's very different from statistics and European travelers, of course, who have a different interest. I mean, they're interested in, you know, the water, they're interested in the mountains, things of that sort. Concrete daily life. Yeah. And that's in a sense what, to come back to your original point, that's what language begins from. Yes. It doesn't begin from ideas, it begins from the human circle.
Well, language, I suppose one of in some of the countries who are ex-colonial countries seeking independence, such as, say, Nicaragua, using Paulo Freire as the teacher.
Exactly.
Because he uses language that is a living.
Yes.
And I'm talking about the literacy campaigns.
Sure.
That have been astonishing. They use the technique of the educator Paulo Freire, who was not say, Ned is a boy, Janie is a girl, Fido is a dog. He uses words like hunger, vision, you know, food, grain,
Yes.
the thing they're fighting for, and so they learn through
Yes.
their very life. That's what you're talking
Yes,
about.
absolutely.
History is from this.
History really is based on in a sense, it begins really in this sort of everyday practice of doing the things that make you human. You know, it's not just, you know, eating and drinking and sleeping and so on, but it's also affection, and it's also the ties, the family ties that between members of a family, and ties them to their place. You know, and if you listen, as I have, not only to my own family, but to the people who live in the camps. For them, even the children, for example, who have never been to Palestine, who have been born abroad, for them it's a real place. I mean, those bonds, now, as opposed to newspeak, a kind of falsified language of abstractions and statistics that gets away from the human and the just, you see, that's the point.
You know, we're talking Edward Said, and as you can gather, it's a different approach when we haven't heard taught the subject of Middle East, specifically Palestine. Are there really Palestinians? Well, I think I'm facing one right now.
I think you are.
A highly literate and thoughtful one who teaches, professor of English at Columbia University, and author of the books Orientalism for one, and the question of Palestine for another. And you've written also about the quite remarkable philosopher, critic, who recently died, Michel
yeah.
Foucault. But perhaps your thoughts generally about you, the world today, maybe even your memories for the last half of the program. Edward Said, professor of English at Columbia University, and the subject is his homeland of his fathers and mothers. Palestine, it's called. So, and we mentioned the Western travelers, and you said they see it each from a different point of view, not the point of view of the indigenous person living there. But I know Twain spoke of it, and others did. Lamartine.
Yeah, Twain really didn't like it at all. I think one of the motifs of a lot of the late sort of 19th century people who came there, very sophisticated people, was that they thought it would be a much grander and interesting place than it was, and it really wasn't. I mean, it was essentially a kind of basically rural place, you know. Obviously, didn't have the language, didn't understand what people were saying, and felt, you know, the sense of wonder at how all these great religions sprung up from there. I mean, how could it have happened? I mean, is the sense you get from The Innocents Abroad, you know. Where does Christianity come from? Surely not this. And he talks about something that my father told me about. My father grew up in Jerusalem. He was born in 1895, so it must have been around the turn of the century, about 30, 40 years after Twain was there. And Twain, you remember, says that a lot of the people around there were showing him pieces of the true cross. One of the stories I remember my father telling me, that as a boy he used to sell crowns of thorns to the tourists. I mean, you know, coming to Palestine, you know, you want to get something from the air. So a crown of thorns. I don't think he traded in pieces of the true cross, but I know that the crowns of thorns were very big in those days. So there's a lot of that. And I think that one of the reasons I have such strong feelings about organized religions, I mean negative feelings about organized, is that I grew up in I was born in a place in which religion was really the sort of the product of the place, you know. I mean, like places, you know, make steel, you know, or cars. Detroit makes cars. Jerusalem makes religions, and I've always thought of it as something rather less pleasant and rather commercial. Right. Yeah, well, I mean, especially if you go into some of the shrines in Jerusalem, like this Holy Sepulchre, where the place is a crisscross of little chapels. You know, I remember I was there once. The last time I was there in 1962. This is before the '67 war, and I was with a friend, and there was a tourist guide going on about the chapels and so on. And we were standing near the place where Christ was supposed to have been actually buried in the sepulchre, and the person was talking about, this is the Greek Orthodox chapel, and this is where Christ is buried. And then I felt a little tug at my arm, and there was this little monk who was a Copt. He said, listen, don't believe a word this man is saying. Christ was buried over here in the Coptic chapel. I mean, it was appalling. You know, I thought the whole notion, and then, you know, you would hear stories of how they would quarrel over who sweeps which part of the church and so on and so forth. So that the aura of religion, in a sense, was totally lost for me. You know, it just become a place of sights and so on and so forth, and commerce, really.
You know, I'm thinking, as you're talking, because this is fantastic, I'm thinking about something that's different cultures in different parts of the world, yet a dominant society, such as ours, or it could be another one equally as highly industrialized, say, if only they were like us, we'd
Yeah.
be good to them. Because you talk about this, the West Mountain, to make the East Western.
Yes.
You see. And if only they were like us, you know, the story is told of LBJ in Vietnam. If only the Vietnamese would be like us, he'd give them everything.
Yeah.
But they say, no, we want to be us.
Yeah.
No, you can't be you,
Yeah.
because we're better than you, you see. We want you to be like us so you'll be better.
Yeah.
No, they wouldn't, so therefore we got to bomb them.
Yeah, that's actually one of the great kind of struggles, I think, in the modern world is what you were talking about, the homogenizing, you know, where we want to turn everybody into, and to a certain extent we've succeeded. I mean, you can find Cokes and blue jeans and hot dogs all over the world, right? But there's a
You got
strange
disco dancing.
disco,
and
the health,
peaking.
absolutely. I mean, you see it everywhere. But on the other hand, there seems to be, I mean, I don't know whether it's a biological thing, but there seems to be a rather stubborn resistance somehow in the human being to retain some sense of not only personal identity, nobody wants to become a number, but also a kind of cultural identity, which is different. I mean, you want to hold on. Now, strangely enough, you were speaking about the Middle East, where the word Arab's supposed to cover everything. Now, I grew up in a society. Now, look at this. I mean, it's hard. Most people find this hard to believe, but it's true. I am, first of all, not only an Arab, but I'm a Palestinian. I'm a Christian, and I'm even more of a minority. I'm a Protestant, and not only a Protestant, but I was born and raised as an Episcopalian. I mean, it's funny. It's funny. But listen, I grew up with other Christians, Greek Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Melkite, Nestorians, Chaldeans, Assyrians, Armenians, Copts, Jews, different kinds of Muslims, Druzes. All of these are part of the mix of what we call the Middle East. Now, it's a highly plural society in which all of these cultures, most of them tremendously old, have retained their identity. Now, sometimes it's almost comic. I mean, why do they bother? Why don't they all just convert to, say, Islam or just mainstream Christianity or Judaism and forget the whole? But they don't. And I like that. I mean, I think the idea of a kind of an endless kind of
You like pluralism.
pluralism.
As simple as that.
Well, and there's also something almost, you know, it's almost antiquarian about, you know, talking to people whose heritage can be traced back and for which they fall. Now, there is a point at which, though, these little sects and so on can become extreme. I mean, you have an example in Lebanon, right? Now, my mother is half Lebanese, and the Christian Lebanese, very tragically, you see, have been involved in a struggle to not just to retain their identity, but to use their identity to lord it over other identities. You understand what I'm trying to say? I mean, that's when it gets to be bad. I mean, it's not just coexistence, but it's really so afraid are you of losing your identity that you've got to fight the other guy and ride him. And that's where the problems begin, I think.
You know, I'm thinking, and listen to you, you know, this is fresh stuff that I know the audience nor I have heard. Because all we know is something general and vague under the heading Arab.
Yeah.
And you might add the word terrorist on occasion, but Arab. Now, we come to something else. This is perhaps part. Toward the end of your book, the paperback, the question about you say, you speak of the Jews and Arabs tied together.
Right.
Because now we come to the what's to be done
Right.
and the what next. So the Jews and the Arabs tied together, and you're implying there can be a living together. And would you mind expanding?
Yeah, I think it's very important to realize that that no matter what happens, the Jews in the Middle East, in Israel, are in essentially an Arab and Islamic world. I mean, they're there. The Arabs number 100+ million. And I think the real problem is to find a way to, I mean, I say quite specifically in the book, for example, that I don't think the Jews are like, for example, the Jews in Israel are like the French in Algeria. I mean, the French in Algeria went out to Algeria to colonize it, and then when the time came, they just went back to France. I mean, although they may have been there 130 years.
we're dealing with a people who've had a very tragic history of suffering and who, in most instances, are in Israel. A great injustice was done to the Palestinians, but they came to Israel to do something for their own people after the tremendous, devastations of World War II to the Jews. So we're dealing with a different problem of people coming to Palestine, and what you have to find then is a solution which will not repeat or perpetuate the cycle of endless expulsions. I mean, and the irony of it is that the Jews who keep saying the Arabs want to drive us into the sea, have driven us into the sea. I mean, the Palestinians. And my feeling is that my genuine feeling is that the best solution is a state in which people live, irrespective of what their confession or the religion is. In other words, they live in a state in which everybody has equal rights. Now, Jews, apparently, in Israel and elsewhere, feel that Israel should be a country principally of Jews. And they don't want it to be, they want it to be, with special Jewish laws or laws for the Jews and so on and so forth, run in a particular way. I have no problem with that. So the second solution would be partition. In other words, there are Arabs in Palestine. There, as I say, there's 600,000+ inside Israel, and there are 1.4 million on the West Bank and Gaza. Therefore, you split the land. That was the original plan. Now, in the nature of things, it seems to me that states that are very close to each other, we're talking about a very tiny bit of land. I'm against the idea of dispersing people. I don't think you can tell people, well, look, there's no room for you here, you've got to go somewhere else. I think that's inhuman. So I think what you've got to do is to find a polity whereby you split the land, and then in the course of time, through natural communication and intercourse, which happens anyway because they're in the same area, they will become as one. And you retain your identity, as you retain your identity, for example, in America, nobody's going to take that away from you, within the melting pot, or within a society in which you can exercise your rights as a human being. I think that is a solution to it. Now, the real problem, I think, is not so much what's happening in Israel, what's happening amongst the Arabs, but I think the United States plays a very important role here. There's been a singular lack of vision and courage, simply because it's easy to just go on as usual, business as usual. Whatever Israel does, it gets more money, because it's popular. You could be elected on that. A congressman or a president can be elected just giving money to Israel. But as to what the money is going for, where's it all going, nobody seems to care. And I think as Americans, we have a tremendous responsibility to try to, because we're very close to a flashpoint, a nuclear flashpoint. The Israelis have a nuclear weapon. The Soviets are around in the area. They have allies and so on. We have allies and clients in the area. And the Middle East, as we know from the news, is extremely volatile. And unless there's a concerted effort to think in terms such as I've been referring to, whereby people can live together as communities, retaining their sense of identity, I think we're heading towards tremendous destruction.
Well, it seems to me what you're asking for is imagination.
Exactly.
Based upon history.
And upon humanity.
And humanity.
Humanity. In other words, a respect for the other person and the other community. And not saying, well, they can all go back. I have lots of Arab friends who say, let them go back where they came from. But that's not true. That can't be done. And similarly, they shouldn't say that to us. You were never there, they say to us. You don't exist. You see?
We're also talking about banality, I think. That's the banality that you're attacking the other book upon. But also the banality of thinking. When Hannah Arendt, whom you quote in the book, and she saw something interesting there, that people would be displaced. She saw that
absolutely
as something crazy happening.
Yes.
We know she referred, to the banality of evil. These were ordinary people doing extraordinary, cruel things.
Right.
Germans at the time.
Yeah.
Let's reverse that. I think it's the evil of banality.
Yes,
That's
absolutely.
the banality, because you're talking about imagination.
Exactly.
And a fresh way of thinking. And this probably.
And it requires courage. It requires courage. You've got to write, because it's so easy to just go on and doing what you've always done. That's the banality part. It's routine.
Yes.
You're always pressing the same button. It's like riding in an elevator every day.
And so we use a stereotype.
You use a stereotype, you think along the same way, and you just go on as usual. Especially if you have the power to do it.
Yeah. Any other thoughts, Kurt? I knew this was going to be a special kind of encounter here. Edward Said, any postscript, anything comes to your mind, personal memory perhaps, or anything comes to your mind before we say goodbye for now?
Well, memory. Oh dear. I wonder whether yeah, the memory is, it's not really a memory, it's a reflection as to whether I was thinking earlier that all the places I grew up in and lived in, first Palestine and then Lebanon, and for a time Egypt, are places that in a funny sort of way are inaccessible to me, you know, through war and tremendous changes. And I just hope that, for example, in the generation of my children, that kind of wiping out of the past won't go on. I mean, it's terribly important to be able to preserve the past in some form, to be able to recapture it.
I know what you're hitting. This is the last thing, because now it comes back to us living here right now in the late part of the 20th century. One of the things I know in our society, United States, there is no sense of past. There is no sense of yesterday. The young kids today don't know of Vietnam.
Yes.
And so a president can say it was a noble adventure,
Yes.
you know, and get away with this obscenity
Yes.
and still not be laughed off the stage.
Right.
Because there was no, just as the Palestines
Yes.
don't exist, Vietnam never did either.
That's
you
right.
see.
That's right. And it's sort of
So we're
interesting.
talking about history.
We're
aren't
talking
we?
about history, and we're talking about not history, because we all know history's out there and it exists, but the
Sense of it.
preservation of history and the sense of it,
Yeah.
so that what you do in the present and the future is guided by the past and by the mistakes and the sufferings of the past, which bear upon, whether you know it or not, everything that you do. I mean, it's terribly important. My son, who's 12 years old, has, partly because he's mystified by the fact that he was born in America and his father's a Palestinian, and he's been to the Middle East, and he hears all this about Palestine, he's decided he wants to be a professor of history, which is interesting. My daughter, who's 10 years old, says she just wants to be a fireman, which I think is funny.
Margaret Fuller said we'll be sea captains.
Right.
And Edward Said is living here now in the United States, of course, sometimes teaching at Columbia University, and not unlike his colleague Noam Chomsky, with whom there's pretty much of an empathy and an agreement on the subject of that thing, that place called Middle East. Believe very much in the right use of language. And if the right use of language, there has to be a kind of thinking that goes along with it.
I agree with that, absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.